We are celebrating the lives of Rowdy and Naya. And symbolically, we are starting the conference with this. It is so important to us. Oh, it's heavy. It's very heavy. Okay, I hope it won't fall. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I think it's steady. This is the Eric Brocard Award. I'm going to read a text from this booklet that you will all receive tomorrow at the birthday celebration, the European Federation of Therapeutic Communities, the first 40 years. The EFTC Eric Brocard Award is an award given to those who have been of great influence for the TC movement and have been active in the field of drug addiction, practice, research, and training. It was given for the first time to Donald Ottenberg during the 8th EFTC conference in Warsaw, 2001. Since then, every 2 years an award has been made at its conference. Every EFTC Eric Brocard Award is a beautiful and unique handmade sculpture from the Belgian artist Cathy Verhege. We're family. Cathy is the wife of Eric, by the way. This bronze sculpture is the perfect illustration of the human spirit and the power of the self-help idea, so important for the work in drug-free therapeutic communities. The sculpture shows how mutual support and involvement gives people the power to come to a new balance in their life. And in the past, we had this award given to Don Ottenberg, Martin Koyman, George De Leon, Juan Corelli and Mario Picchi, Anthony Slater, Griffith Edwards, Naya Arbiter, and Naya together with George are the only non-Europeans to receive it, and Naya is the only woman to receive it. As I said last time, this doesn't say a lot about our federation. This has to be changed. Eric Brocard, it was named after him after his passing, okay. Albert Sabates, Babis Poulopoulos, Anna Tsiboukli, and this year, Rowdy Yates. And it's also important to say that Eric and Rowdy were very good friends. But for me, it is important also to mention that the decision to give this to Rowdy was made while Rowdy was alive. And because we both were part of this nominating committee, I had to tell him that he had to be excluded from the committee. So he knew that he was going to be receiving the award here, in his home, here in Glasgow. And I'm happy that he knew that. To me, Rowdy was a mentor in many ways. To us, to all of us, someone very, very important. And before I ask Kathleen to come and receive the award on Rowdy's behalf, I'm going to use another Greek word. The word therapist, therapon, okay? The word therapon, therapist, first appears in Homer's Iliad, but it doesn't mean therapist. It means servant. Therapon was the servant who would help the warrior to put his armor on so that the warrior could go and fight the battle. And this really, I think, symbolizes what Rowdy was, what we should be, what I should be. Servants. We're people who make ourselves available to the ones who trust us with their health, even with their lives. And this is an incredible gift. It is a privilege, but it's also a great responsibility. And that's all we are, servants. And to me, Rowdy was a servant who served literally thousands. I'm very proud that as a federation, we had Rowdy in our midst. Kathleen, please, would you come?
Well, first of all, I would like to say thank you so much. It gives me great joy to accept this award on Rowdy's behalf. I'm Kathleen Yates. Rowdy was my husband, partner, friend for over 40 years. And during that time, every 2 years, we would have the EFTC conference. And Rowdy would be involved for months and months with the scientific committee, talking to people, engaging with people, networking with people, getting people together to celebrate what he felt was his life's work and his passion, which was providing services for people who were struggling with addiction. Okay, there are researches, they're evidence-based, but underneath it was that passion to provide inclusive, sustainable services for people who were struggling with addiction. And he did this with great irreverence, with great wit. He was not one to be molded into some plastic saint. He was what he was. And he enjoyed meeting with everybody. Yesterday, I went to visit the residential centre that Phoenix has in Glasgow, and I went there twice. People told me not to go twice because of my old legs, but I wanted to do that because every time at every conference, Rowdy would visit the residential centres, talk to people, to the residents, the students there, the workers there, involve with them, hear their stories, because that's at the core of what he was. So, at the last conference in Thessaloniki, myself, Rod Mullen, Naya Arbiter, and Rowdy were privileged to do a 2-day workshop with a number of people who were actually at this conference in Scotland. And we had such joy doing that. It was such a wonderful experience, and I am so glad that we were able to do that before COVID locked us all down, and then in the end, COVID took Rowdy. So, we miss Naya, who was such a friend and such a role model for me. A woman who, with such power, such intelligence, such fantastic passion and such grace. We miss her with so much. But, okay, life must go on. And so one of the things I wanted to do is thank you all for coming here. Thank you all for continuing with this work, and hope that although they're not in this space with us here, Rod and Naya are around in their spirits, and they will give us the faith, the hope, and the grace to continue this work and to continue meeting with good intent. So thank you, Phoenix Futures, thank you, EFTC, and thank everybody for being here. Thank you, family.
Dr. John Burns was a friend of Rowdy's, a colleague, and I know that Rowdy was also a mentor in a different way, but was also a mentor to you, John, right? Yes, so please, if you would like to share a few words with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Faden. Irascible, having or showing a tendency to be easily angered. Synonyms include irritable, short-tempered, tetchy, crabbit, snappy, grouchy, cross, and crusty. I'm sure he'd take great umbrage to that last one. In our last correspondence, Rowdy described himself as well on the return to my irascible persona. And it made me think, yep, sounds about right, but only sometimes. I'm not sure, but I think it describes some of his career trajectory as involving the transition from being a crabbit sod to a crabbit old sod. But wait, antonyms for irascible include cheerful, friendly, good-tempered, patient, amiable, and good-humoured. I'm sure all of us who knew Rowdy, even just a little, can identify with those as fitting adverbs. And this, for me, helps capture what Rowdy was. All of those things and more, and often at the same time. And this is the man of whom I've been asked to say a few words about in terms of his academic impact. So let me begin by saying that I knew, even before I started preparing, that I would never do this justice, but I'll try and give you an idea of some of it. One of the challenges is trying to consider Rowdy's academic impact in isolation. He would bristle at the description of himself as an academic, maybe even more so than that description as crusty. And that's because his academic work was about so much more than what tends to consume most academics, what tends to drive their careers and form their identities. Sure, Rowdy wrote books, chapters of books, papers, research papers, but Rowdy started out in the drugs field, garnering lived experience, i.e. using drugs, which he'd go on to use that experience in a career spanning multiple decades, focused on helping others. His academic pursuits were born from his working life, which itself can't really be disentangled from his life experience. During his 23 years with Lifeline, which provided support to people with addiction problems, Rowdy worked as volunteer, staff member, manager, and CEO. In 1992, he published a book, If It Weren't for the Alligators, History of Drugs, Music and Popular Culture in Manchester, which is still available on Amazon and has only one review, but it is a 5-star review. Written in 2014, and I only mention it because it notes, I needed this for my dissertation, and actually ended up reading the book in one sitting, and then had to go back and use it for reference material. It's a well-written story of Lifeline and its beginnings. So already some academic impact from his first book. What the review fails to mention is that Rowdy was probably the person setting the dissertation topic and driving up book sales, such as the privilege of academics. In 1993, Rowdy left Lifeline to become director of the Scottish Drugs Training Programme at the University of Stirling, which offered training to the addictions workforce across Scotland. I'd have been 10 or 11 years old at the time. And I mention this because had I been older, or had it started later, our paths might have crossed earlier. Because what led me into academia was similar to what led Rowdy, and that the work that we took part in, the work that we delivered in services, was what was important and led us into the research world. And I have to say that that's perhaps my only regret in terms of my relationship with Rowdy, that we met so late in his career. When I was beginning my career, around 2003, Rowdy had moved into Stirling's Faculty of Social Science, or School of Social Science, or Faculty of Applied Social Science, or whatever guise it was working under, and I like to have a wee grumble about that. But regardless of what it was called, Rowdy specialised in addiction research and teaching at Stirling from 2001. And it would be another dozen or so years before he and I would meet. In that time, Rowdy would work to challenge thinking and help others develop critical thinking skills. Arguably the main pursuit of any good academic when teaching is you don't teach students what to think, you teach them how to think. And in the addictions research and theory field, there's plenty of opportunity to challenge the orthodoxy with some critical thinking, something Rowdy did regularly, and I think on numerous occasions with much glee. He shared stories of working with national governments and various committees and groups set up to consider drug policy. He enjoyed pushing boundaries and challenging the thinking to do different, not simply for the sake of it, but because he knew we could do better. But I do think he enjoyed the disruption, maybe more so than he'd ever let on, and sometimes with journal article titles designed to be contentious. So I worked with Rowdy on a study about integrated addiction services in Scotland at a time when there was a widely held view of integration as the panacea, the way forward. Rowdy came up with the title, Integration, Too Much of a Bad Thing, which was fine for him because he didn't need to work in an integrated addiction service on a daily basis when the article was published. So he published over 40 articles, most of which sought to provide challenge. For example, only available in black, the limiting of addiction services in the 20th century, where a whole century's worth of addiction services received his ire. He wrote Recovery We Can Afford, an analysis of a sample of comparative cost-based studies, and another called Cost Benefits of TCs. And that's because he knew that when it came to brass tacks, commissioners and governments want cheap solutions, but also effective solutions. His work spans from drug courts in Scotland through to drug policy over the last 150 years, but his unrelenting focus was always on TCs and focusing on evidence-informed practice and practice-informed evidence. And it's this philosophy that Rowdy and I have in common. Rowdy's work has been cited it's been cited by hundreds and read by thousands. He raised hundreds of thousands of pounds in grant income for University of Stirling and laid the foundations for what has become the main addictions research centre in Scotland. These are the types of metrics upon which academics typically rely on and call upon to justify their jobs. In academia, we talk about publisher peril, this notion that if you're not publishing in the scientific literature, then you're not really working. But for Rowdy, I think while these metrics had some importance to him, they were a means to an end. They kept him in a job which allowed him to focus on what really mattered to him, trying to influence drug policy more broadly and to develop TCs specifically. Where you invest your time is where you invest your life. And a large part of Rowdy's time was invested in TCs, whether it was providing informal advice and support or through solo or collaboration projects, working to develop guidelines, practitioner handbooks and governance documents to support TCs to deliver evidence-informed support and in turn for the support that TCs provide to inform the scientific evidence base. Rowdy, along with his great friend and co-conspirator, Eric Brokart, led on the establishment of the EFTC's scientific wing, EWDOR, the European Working Group on Drug-Oriented Research, and together they led the EFTC to the successful self-funded organisation which it is today. Rowdy used to open conferences by saying, "Good morning, family," and that is how he thought of the EFTC. And I just want to take a wee minute to think about that and to underline why trying to talk about his academic impact is so difficult. So if we go way back, Rowdy had drug problems, which he resolved in part through using a particular method. Rowdy went on to work in academia to study and develop that method. Rowdy worked with others across the world to develop the evidence base on that method, and he called those whom he worked with his family. It suggests at least two things. Rowdy loved his work, TCs and his TC family, and that all of these things link in. So it's difficult to only talk about academic impact when his academic impact is so broad and it affects so many. So if you'll indulge me a little, I'll talk about his impact on me from a mostly academic perspective. So in 2014, I had just completed an MSc, a master's degree in alcohol and drug studies at another university, and I was flirting with the idea of undertaking a PhD to build on that project. Now, when it comes to selecting a PhD supervisor in Scotland, you can really take your pick. There's quite a few options. You pitch them your idea, and they'll decide whether to take you on. So I did my research, I created a shortlist. A PhD can very much hinge on the relationship between the candidate and the supervisor, so making the right choice is critical. I wrote to Rowdy, asked if we could meet to discuss my idea, and I met him in his office, and I was struck by how warm, funny, and candid he was. The man I was having a conversation with had an MBE for services in the prevention of drug addiction, an encyclopedic knowledge of the drugs field. Excuse me. My homework had found him to be an eminent scholar, a description to which he would cringe. He had a picture on the wall of him addressing a UN council. There were bookcases filled to the brim with books, and here we were talking like two old pals. I told him about the backstory to my research, and apologies for the shameless plug, but I'm doing plenary 1 tomorrow on that research if anybody's interested. And he told me that he'd been waiting his entire career for a PhD topic like this. So suffice to say, I left that meeting knowing who my PhD supervisor was going to be, and the shortlist went in the bin. As a PhD supervisor, Rowdy was great. He pushed me, nurtured me, challenged me, reassured me, and championed me. I really couldn't have asked for much more. I was studying part-time and working full-time, so the PhD took 4.5, 5 years, and as you might expect, was a real challenge at times. Rowdy wrote me into my first research assistant job, which unbeknownst to me at the time would be the first of a few stints as a research assistant, and we worked really well together, co-authoring papers and putting the world to rights. Rowdy had faith in me when I had little. He encouraged me to apply to present my work at various conferences, which I did, and in retrospect, that was perhaps my tryouts before encouraging me to apply to present to EFTC and EWDOR conferences. And to that end, I was extremely fortunate and forever grateful. I used to joke that there was some truth, that I saw more of the world while studying a PhD than I had done before it, presenting in Greece, Belgium, Ireland, and Rome. And I should say, I saw more of Rome than I'd maybe have liked with Kathleen dragging me around every wee chapel that she could find. But they were lovely. I did say to him I was worried about getting preferential treatment because of his role, and he told me that it was the opposite, that he'd hold me to a higher standard, and in typical Rowdy fashion said, and I quote, so please excuse the language, "If your work was shite, you wouldn't be anywhere near the conference." There were other times where the compliments were less backhanded. I remember in Greece, my wife and my then 3-year-old daughter went for lunch with Rowdy and Kathleen, and he with a conference in full flow, and no doubt really important matters pressing, was quite happy to spend a couple of hours playing with my daughter. As I was preparing this speech, my daughter asked what I was doing, and I told her. And she said it was to tell you that he was the man with the big beard that played cards with her, carried on he was Santa, and that he was kind and funny. And he was. While Rowdy's self-described voice, like gravel through a lawnmower, is missed in academia, his legacy lives on. Through me, through other PhD candidates, through the many students he taught on the modules that he wrote, but perhaps, most importantly, through all of you and his TC family. It's okay to be sad that he's gone, but it's vital that we take solace in the fact that he was here at all, and that he was ours to know, to love, to teach, and to learn from. With respect, though, I now think it's incumbent on us to do his legacy justice, but not to do it for him. Do it for our residents, the people who come to TCs and to treatment for help. So don't do it for him, but do it because of him. Implement and develop standards. Deliver support in a way that's both evidence-informed and informs the evidence. Develop the evidence base for TCs in the way he did. Standing on the shoulders of giants, we have only one responsibility: to see further, to go further. And this is what I ask you. Take advantage of the opportunities and the legacy that he provided us, to go further and to rise to the challenge that he set out at TC conferences regularly. And in this interview, which I'll quote him on to finish, he said, "We need to encourage research to move from exploring whether TCs work. We already know it does. We need to move towards a focus on how it works and how we might make it work better. To do this will be to do his legacy the justice it deserves and create the future that he wanted for all of us." Thank you.
Amazing. George will share a few thoughts about both Rowdy and Naya. And if I'm not mistaken, Rod, yesterday would have been Naya's 70th birthday?
Yes.
Right? Yes. So, please, George.
I know we only have a few, for me, a relatively few minutes, which actually is a challenge for me. And so the specific request for me to speak about Naya here was to comment on what I see has been her contributions to the TC, which is a little bit different than all of my memories and feelings about her. So I've contained those. I won't speak much about that, although they continue every day in one way or another. Soon the TC world will find out, will know about her, the extent and breadth and depth of Naya's contributions. There are a number of projects I know that Rod is working on and others to actually make manifest the writings, the videos, so that there's a real compendium of what the formal contributions have been. So that can't be contained in a 10-minute talk. I'm actually going to try to talk about her in terms of subtle contributions that have bended the arc of the therapeutic community evolution. They're probably not known, they're not really written about, but most of them come from my observations that came out of my interactions with her and how they influenced my thinking, and gradually, as I've seen it evident in how others have incorporated it in their work. So these are in the form of concepts that she, conceptual words, practices. But look, her impact in this regard was really in terms of the many roles that she played in this field. You know her in different ways. An indefatigable teacher, which I think is in many ways her number one role, a brilliant clinician, an inspirational speaker, an effective social political activist, but also in person-to-person roles. Her one-on-one roles, whether it's in social interactions or even clinical interactions, as a cosmic mother of inexhaustible generosity. Now, I realize that this is a little florid in the way I've described that, but when you consider her movement around the world in these various roles, we can't even record the influences in any meaningful way, but we know that they happened. And so that every time I would meet her, I would experience some of these. And it's important in many ways to understand that contribution in these general terms. And that's one of the reasons I try to give them kind of categorical labels. Her focus has been on those suffering from addiction, mental illness, and trauma, particularly among the socially marginalized, the incarcerated, the disaffiliated. Her influences on policy and people, direct and indirect, have been transformational and life-changing. Again, the measurement of somebody's impact on an individual or a field escapes us frequently. It's hard to detect it, except when you encounter it. So over some 40 years, 45 years that I had known her, I have encountered that with her, side by side with her or interactionally with her. But there are some specific contributions to the TCs that are evident, that in addition to those broad categorical roles that I refer to, they come out of all of her roles. I mentioned some words that are conceptual, also actual ways in which she changed negative practices, what she termed TC warts. Of course, what she was referring to there is the traditional stereotypical, negative stereotypical views that too many in our field have had of TCs, some of those warranted. You know, harshness, abuse, misuse of the word confrontation, misuse of the word encounter in the field, and so on. Things that I can talk further with you about independently, but all of that, those warts, she had something to say about, and she countered them by introducing other language. For example, sanctuary. The fact that her own programs, of course, were sanctuary bound, even though in some cases there were limited resources and settings to do that, it was always a first objective to create sanctuary. Her view of therapeutic communities had as its essential ingredient sanctuary. You know, and we know, of course, this bears upon words like safety, and that in turn reflects a fundamental ingredient of the success of the TC community when it is practiced properly as essentially physical and psychological safety, so that individuals can ultimately disclose who they are to themselves and to others. So if your program essentially did not have some organized view of creating sanctuary, it was limited in her view, but also, of course, it was a word that powerfully contradicts some of the negative stereotypical TCs. My own comment about that is, you know, remember that some of those warts and all were justified, and of course we're happy that they have passed, but they're not passed enough. Trauma, the word trauma, you know, believe it or not, Naya and I, in some of our conversations over the years, that word came up very early. Now, this may be an obvious comment, but you need to hear it. And that is, we were talking about trauma. TCs were addressing trauma from almost the first days. So, and of course, why it needs to be said now is because now we see it as a kind of standalone, independent, evidence-based approach, which is correct, that it has been essentially developed and advanced by non-TC people, and is very useful in TCs. But you should record for history that it was from the first days, there was already an agreed-upon intuitive acceptance in the TC that if you didn't get to trauma, you couldn't have any stable recovery. And so that offsets the stereotypical picture of all behavior change and behavior modification and all that, all those elements. We had a view of that, which is that, you know, if you didn't make behavior change, you couldn't deal with the traumatic issues. You couldn't revisit them. We can talk about that at another time, but that was part of my conversations with her, and the issues of, you know, the fundamental understanding of how people recover, which is they change first and then they deal with some of the deepest issues of their lives. Another key, again, indirect but potent change in the field is that the idea that the inner environment of the TC was critical. The physical inner environment was critical to the change process. Now, I had reminded her in a recent visit, a couple of years back when I was in LA and visiting one of the facilities there, which is in a dilapidated area of homeless, and it was so striking to me about how Amity had recreated in that setting, in that external environment, a different world internally for the clients that they were serving. Her eye for beauty influenced the interiors of Amity program environments, we know that, but furnishings, floorings, paintings, accessories instantly declared a different space. Safety, sanity, calm, peace, welcome, love. These, of course, illustrate the insight that the first meaningful psychological intervention in therapeutic communities is the physical environment. And to the extent, this is a brief commentary on that, to the extent that the TCs moving into the mainstream also involved working in physical environments were so deprived because of resources, you could not imagine what we were already, the deficit that we were working with. if the inside of the treatment program looked like the outside neighborhood, you know what I mean, that it was situated in, that was a great liability. Synanon recognized this when they tried to place in the early days TCs in good neighborhoods. So the inside world of our community is different from the outside. The first and constant message of TC is, of course, all about change. And that's the reason why that's a deep statement. It's not simply an aesthetic statement. For our populations who came out of a certain suffering and reflected a certain suffering, the idea that the very first thing that they would see is a changed environment is a critical but often unobserved intervention that we make. That's the first intervention we make when a client walks into a program. What that looks like, sounds like, and feels like is a critical intervention. A big area of change that she's had an enormous influence on, quite subtly, like below the radar, is the preoccupation with affirmation. Why? One of the classical, stereotypical critiques of TC is that it relies on correction. It relies on essentially, some people think, punishment. Well, we did have unfortunate examples of that in various programs. They're not, of course, they're not as prominent as our critics would have it. But we did see it, and we do see it, unfortunately, in some not well-run prison programs that still go on. But even in the community-based programs and the well-known programs in the United States, anyway, there was both an inappropriate and an appropriate observation about how much negative correctional influences that we use to get people to change. Do we use too much, what we would call punishments or learning, contracts and so on. And even in our verbal interactions, are the verbal interactions too harsh? And what do we expect from that? Well, Naya early on was, of course, very sensitized to the issues of affirmation. And we've had a number of conversations about that, influenced my thinking on this, and I've tried to write about that in some of the original, in the Red Book. But you need to hear it here. Is again, how do you begin changing an approach by essentially capturing another view of a very important concept? Maybe we should shift to affirmational approaches, not at the expense of using essentially beneficial corrective strategies. Because here's an irony, and we're going to hear more about it, and I'm sure she agreed with this, is that without the correctional strategies, you can essentially run into error with only affirmation, all support and no correction and no change. It's not realistic. But the whole view of the word affirmation as being an overriding philosophical attitude toward the client and the approach. It's all about building, all about saying yes, and all about acknowledging positive change. I tried to, based on a lot of my discussions with Naya, I tried to essentially understand the affirmational process in a way that it could be trained and taught, not only in staff, but in the residents, of course. And the idea of making the distinction about the word affirmation having two components, namely supportive, just general supportive, but then specific, a second use of the word affirmation, specific reinforcement for actual perceived change, which the client needs to hear, because if they don't hear it that way, it's not credible to them. We can support and support and support all day long, but that won't bring about long-term change. What brings it about, if you're using affirmation, is the specific reinforcement. The way you are, first way you came into this program, you looked this way, and here you are 3 months later, and you look this way, and I've watched you grow in this way and that way. Specific reinforcements. That came out of not exhaustive, but on-the-road discussions with Naya, and the concept that the TC going forward has to be an affirmationally approached program is profound, but not at the expense of judicious corrective teaching and corrective practices. Incidentally, I think a lot of the corrective, so-called corrective, is not contracts and learning experiences, but actually, believe it or not, is theory. When I would do recent training in prison TCs, we didn't have a lot of time. I was very struck by the fact when I provided the rationale for why we have to correct behavior in a TC model, a lot of those clients, their intellectual understanding of that, before they even got it emotionally, made sense to them and essentially increased their engagement in the process. So there's a long teaching, there's a long exploration we need to have around affirmations and corrections. Her effect, direct and indirect on policy. You know, she was a panelist and presenter in numerous venues at all levels of government, you know what I mean? And particularly the most renowned ones were the White House conferences, the things in Washington that she would appear at. And there, her splendid public speaking talents were very evident, because there she was talking to non-TC people and legislators and others. And to ask the question, has she had an influence on the arc of the TC, profound in that respect. She invariably, as an astute and ingenious producer with visuals and so on, and as well as her scripted writings, were unmatched. That loss, that we don't have that character in the TC world, is profound. From a strictly kind of practical point of view, you cannot imagine what we've lost in that treasure, that she was able to do that everywhere and anywhere. Research. Well, you know, we consider here she is a clinician and a teacher, and yet she was very, very involved and interested, intellectually, continually interested in research in every field, as a matter of fact, but certainly in TCs. And some of her early role work in Synanon was research. You know what I mean? She got involved in it very early. She was committed to that. And I made a note here that when the NIDA funded my Therapeutic Community Center for Research, we were able to, using with one of my mentees, a wonderful mentee named Harry Wexler, who was going to conduct a major program at Amity, which is the great prison TC, and would transform prison TC approaches. That program, of course, was so heavily, Rod and Naya, so heavily invested in the success of that program. But she was particularly always interested in not only politically using the data of research to advance TC, but intellectually interested in the research in TC. She wanted why things worked and why they didn't work. And so even, for example, aside from that landmark study at Academy, those of you who haven't read it, of course you should know it, it's part of your own education. But some other publications, one notable one was I had committed to the idea that as we got closer to reconceiving the TC as more teaching than simply treating, the idea of using the most skilled teachers in the TC, both residents and staff, was critical, and I called those the senior professors, and the most senior professors, of course, were graduates or even graduate staff who had moved through TCs and completed their TC experience. And we did publish a rather important paper showing that when senior professors are more involved in major activities, particularly frontline orientation activities, you increase retention and treatment. She was deeply fascinated and moved by that. And essentially, wherever she would talk, I would hear some reference to the senior professor. There's one, I don't have it on here, but I want to, I think maybe I will end with that in a moment, but in terms of her influences in the TC movement on training and staff development, well, that one, you know, simply having access to her written materials on this and her curricula on this will overwhelm you. But in fact, you see evidence of the power of that worldwide. Yesterday we were talking about the Japanese effects in there, and her influence that way as a trainer and as a staff development pioneer Extensive creatively conceived texts and videos, I mentioned a bit about that before, on curricular for both residents and staff with a particular focus on women to adjust for gender imbalances. It's not that there was women prominence, but the imbalance that we knew was chronic in the whole treatment field and certainly in the TCs. The only way that could be adjusted is by essentially affirmatively focusing on women, and her impact on the entire women's role in therapeutic communities is extraordinary. Not only in terms of the residents, of course, on a face-to-face daily basis, but on the wide-ranging training impacts, both formal and informal mentoring that she's had for bringing out the great women. One private comment I don't even have on this, but I got into the TC field partly because of a close friend of mine by the name of Zev Putterman, and that brought Naya and I closely because she was in Synanon when Zev was around, and so that essentially formed our connection. And it was Zev's comment to me shortly before he died. He was involved with Amity at various segments of his life. Was that he never appreciated the importance, the need, the meaning of women, not only in his life but in this whole field. But for Naya, who brought him to that, and then the Amity experiences he had in that. So that's a profound effect on women in any biography, TC or otherwise. If they don't capture a Naya arbiter, they're missing a profound individual in the history of the influence on women, particularly in treatments, not simply TCs. One that I was always struck with is in terms of a kind of social activism, how great involvement in public health and so on immediately got translated into Amity programs, and I'm sure she taught it in every program she went to, and that is it had to do with TC program elements informing general health, nutrition, climate change, and I think that Rod has been talking about, I think he's going to be talking about at this conference too, if I understand it. Look, I want to end, I haven't seen any signals, so I presume that I'm not over my, whoopsie, I'm seeing the two fingers right now. So I'm going to end this way. Look, one that again, of course, I'm going to keep talking about as long as people will listen, is her and I, our deep involvement, but certainly hers, where she made it very clear to me because she was on the ground practicing it every day. The TC, moving the TC out of the narrow idea of treatment and the idea that really what we were doing was teaching. And we, even to the point where we talk about, and she talked about teaching communities and as well as treatment communities. This is a profound step in the arc of the evolution of TC. We have to move out of the narrow concept of treatment and realize it's the broader concept of teaching people how to regain their lives and live in new ways. And of course, that's how deep and wide TCs really run when they are practiced right. That's tomorrow's discussion. But anyway, we've lost a great human being. And for me, some of you might have detected, and I've said everywhere, that loss has been quite unbearable. I have to share that with you. But I'm an old fetcher from years back, but it's an unbearable loss. But for the field, it's immeasurable.
Thank you, George. Thank you. Last but not least, we have Karen Biggs, the Chief Executive of Phoenix Features. Please. Oh, together. Yes, with Doug Bond. Okay, great.
Thank you, Faden. I'm going to invite Doug to speak first. He can introduce himself and I'll follow.
Hi, good morning to everyone. My name is Doug Bond, CEO for Amity Foundation. George, thank you for the amazing words about Naya. I'm going to speak more from my personal experience with Naya. I first met Naya when I was 5 years old. I was in foster homes and orphanages while both my parents were incarcerated. We talked earlier about the importance of family and the generational impact on community, and certainly one of Naya's greatest passions was supporting that. I was able to come to Amity with my parents for several years in the therapeutic community, and Naya helped make that happen. Rod, my heart goes out to you, of course, and love you and Naya dearly. Rod taught me a lot about the job that I'm in right now, and Naya taught me a lot about the role and the heart of what we're doing in the therapeutic community. And so I just want to honor her in that notion, and also really acknowledge the role that women play in the therapeutic communities. Our organization is led by an amazing group of women that are culture carriers, and Naya helped to really embrace that and build that for the therapeutic community. I'm going to read a letter by Jessie Lasoya, who is in the role that Naya was in as the Vice President of Services and Training. On this day, my friends and I remember our mentor, friend, and Amity co-founder, Naya Arbiter. I am humbled and touched by the time she shared with us. Yesterday was her birthday, and being here together at the EFTC in Glasgow is fitting. I know that she would be proud of all the good work that each of you are doing to build community. My name is Jess Lasoya, and I am one of her countless students. We work together on curricula, ceremonies, workshops, and creating community for the past decade. Since Naya's passing, the seasons have now made half of their turn along the circle of the sun. The rising light now falls, bringing people closer together as we gather and account for the harvest of our efforts. Naya's life was dedicated to teaching others and awareness of our behavior, our family history, our physical and emotional climate, how to create a glorious environment for the students and their families and children. We remember now how she planted the seeds which have borne fruit for so many of us. We remember the many stories from diverse cultures that have illuminated our past and awakened the deep and forgotten edges of our own root systems. Historically, in so many traditions, the autumn equinox is celebrated as a time of gathering, sharing, remembering, giving thanks, and strengthening the bonds of community which connect us all. Now it has become our turn to do so as she did, help each other harvest the gifts we have earned and received. She showed us how to do this for so many years with poise and dignity. Naya is our reminder to continue to share, learn, grow, and love. Like the cycles of our seasons, our grief at her loss, and the loss of many beloved friends, we move forth and evolve and change. The burning sun and the heat of summer fade as the mornings and nights grow cooler. Animals begin migrations, gathering in their own celebration of the changing seasons. The autumn equinox, with 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night, is a moment of perfect balance in the Earth's journey. This year, our autumn equinox is Friday, September 23rd. All of us here that knew her or appreciated the work she has done for the therapeutic community movement, may we pause in the silence and reflect on how we can carry on the good work of her example. I'd like to just one moment of silence, a minute of silence. Thank you. And now may we all continue to light the lamps of our hope for others and greet the poet Rumi told us, let the beauty of what you love be what you do. Onward, Jess Lasoya. Thank you.
You can't have founding fathers without some mothers around. But for a long time, it felt to me like the TC world was a male bastion, created by men, for men, talked about by men, to men. Now, don't get me wrong, they were and are lovely men, compassionate, brilliant, funny, focused, but where were the women? Where was the woman's voice, the woman's story in the history the men like to talk about so much? It was invisible to me. And that made it harder for me to see where I fitted into the story of the future. and then I met Naya. My friend and TC mentor, Bob Campbell, pulled me into the EFTC world. And one day he said, "You have to meet Naya, you'll like her." And he wasn't wrong. George has talked about Naya's expertise, her deep commitment to the TC method, her ability to think and to educate. She has taught so much to so many. She encouraged me to be brave and to open those services that no one else had for women no one else cared about. And when I had to close one, she told me that wasn't failure, it was learning. And the time would come again to use that learning. And she was so right. She taught us that those founding fathers did indeed have women by their side who played a crucial role. She taught us that our role in the world was to be world citizens and to look after ourselves and our planet. Naya's legacy for me, and for many of the women I know, is the women's stories that she gave us, and her voice giving us a voice. My commitment to Naya and to our community is to keep her work alive through what we do, by sharing her words, her thoughts with others who will make their own sense from the inspiration that she gives. I love to watch women watch her speak. And I confess, I used to place myself at these conferences so I could see the women in my organisation watch her. One of those moments was in Dublin in 2017. Now, you can go online and hear Naya say these words herself, and she does a much better job of it than I will. But I wanted to share some of them with you today. Women's work. Through centuries and cultures, certain work has been ascribed to women. The raising of children, the sewing of clothes, the emotional fabric of family, the keeper of secrets, mourners at the grave, witnesses at the crucifixion. There are women who wait, those who decorate, those who teach. There are those who do not appear in history. Women's work. Those who are ever patient, those who are counted on to be there, those who prostitute, those who serve as domestics, those who serve as ornaments. Those who bear the pain of childbirth and those who bear the pain of isolation. There are women whose friendships survive all other ties, and there are those unable to sustain female companionship. There are women who have raised their voices in sisterhood for themselves and for each other. There are those whose silence is louder than any spoken word. There are women who have paved the way by their independence or slavery, setting examples which guide and warn those of us who follow. Some women, liberated to competence, have opened career paths and possibilities for thousands behind. Women have been the first in their century, their culture, their profession. Women's work. An expression that lives on through centuries and cultures. Women. Living longer lives each decade, often surviving all those we have loved. Have we, as women, improved our ability to live with ourselves? The woman's voice, the woman's song. What verses do we add as each year passes? That piece goes on, and at the end, Naya asks us all to open more doors for those coming behind us than were open for us. And for me, that's Naya. Some of you will have attended the conference that Kathleen spoke about earlier in Greece in 2019, run by Rowdy, Kathleen, Naya, and her partner Rod. And at the end of that session, we were given a token. In fact, each time I saw Naya, she gave me a frog, or an eagle, or a turtle carved out of stone. And I have them on my desk, and they connected me to her strength, inspiration, since we've started to get to know each other many years ago. As you leave the hall today, You're invited to take a pebble, small enough to carry in your pocket or to sit on your desk. The pebble has a tree of life painted on it. The tree of life represents the interconnectedness of everything in the universe. It symbolizes togetherness and serves as a reminder that we are never alone or isolated, but connected to the world. Before we bring our celebration of life for Rowdy and Naya to a close, we wanted to share something with you. Rowdy loved nothing more than to come to the TC in Glasgow and spend time with residents and staff. He would talk to them about the TC principles, challenge them if he thought we weren't quite getting things right, and generally be part of the community. He would also bring his guitar some nights and sing with the residents. Rowdy wrote the song In This House, and always has said to me that he didn't want to say it was an anthem, but I told him it was. In October 2012, he performed that song in this building with the residents of Phoenix, Glasgow. That moment was recorded, and we'd like to end this session with In This House by Rowdy Yates and the 2012 Phoenix Choir. Thank you.
In This House. Basically, the song says, forget all the people who tell you you can't change, that that's how your life is going to be. Get out and do it and change. In this house. We were lost and alone on a dark, winding road. Every moment brought more misery and pain. Every turning we could see brought us back down on our knees. You told us we would always be the same. But in this house we will wrestle with the demons of our past. In this house we will struggle to make changes that will last. In this house, the cost is courage at a price we can afford. All the no chance kids are coming home restored. And we have torn everyone who reached out from the heart. We have killed the hopes of family and friends. But our journey through the night brought us back into the light, to a place where we might try to make amends. In this house we will wrestle with the demons of our past. In this house we will struggle to make changes that will last. In this house the cost is courage at a price we can afford. All the no chance kids are coming home restored. And in the past we have tried to reach the other side, but our hopes were all just empty in your eyes. While the fire was in our blood, you just tried to stem the flood and contain the bitter whirlwind of our lives. In this house we will wrestle with the demons of our past. In this house we will struggle to make changes that will last. In this house the cost is courage at a price we can afford. All the no chance kids are coming home restored. And you say it's for our own good, but we want this understood. We demand the right to live our lives anew. And if you won't support our fight to turn darkness into light, oh, get off the road, the kids are coming through. In this house we will wrestle with the demons of our past. In this house we will struggle to make changes that will last. In this house the cost is courage at a price we can afford. All the no chance kids are coming home restored. In this house
we will wrestle with the demons of our past. In this house we will struggle to make changes that will last. In this house the cost is courage at a price we can afford. All the no chance kids are coming home restored.
in this house we will wrestle with the demons of our past. In this house we will struggle to make changes that will last. In this house the cost is courage at a price we can afford. All the no chance kids are coming home restored. All the no chance kids are coming home restored.